thank you everyone for being here today. We are so excited to be able to kick off our spring semester with another round of Transformative Play Initiative lectures. This one is from Lauri Lukka, and I have to tell you, I read Lauri's work for years, and when I met him, I was such a fangirl because there were very few people that were talking about the psychology of play, which is a very important topic, and I was confused by that. It seems like, you know, role-playing is prime for psychological thinking. There's just so much going on in the mind. And so over the years, he and I have had a lot of really awesome chats and email exchanges, and his thinking has definitely influenced mine. And so I'm very happy to hear where he's at in his process of being a designer and a psychologist working in the world. And so I will read his official bio. Lauri Lukka is a licensed psychologist and designer. As a psychologist, he has focused on clinical psychology and therapeutic interventions. As a designer, he has written several freeform scenarios and papers on the intersection of psychology and games. Currently, he works as a senior service designer in an IT and strategy consultancy, and he writes his PhD in Aalto University based on game-based digital therapeutics. And so if you don't know who I am, I'm Sarah Bowman from the Transformative Play Initiative at Uppsala University. And today we're going to have an hour of lecture, and then we're going to have 30 minutes of Q&A. If you're here live, you can use the Q&A feature, which is preferred, or you can put questions in the chat. But Lauri isn't necessarily watching the chat as he's talking, so we will put those questions in the Q&A afterwards. So with that, Lauri, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction, and it's wonderful to be with you here this evening, and also for those who are watching this in the future. Great to meet you. I'm now in the snowy and beautiful wintry Helsinki, hosting this lecture that honestly I have been thinking quite a while about what I want to talk about, and the topic today is designing intensity. Let me share my screen. I wanted today to do something where I want to focus on something rather concrete, but at the same time build sort of a theory and larger thinking around that concrete example. And that is why we are working with a case study here today that will kind of span throughout this lecture that we have here today. So, but perhaps before I begin the main portion, maybe we can warm up with me disclosing a bit about my background, because I'm a firm believer in the fact that context shapes how we think, and the context that we choose to go in considerably are, well, of course we choose them based on our perhaps intuition, based on our personality, but on the other hand, the context that we choose will influence us. And therefore, I would talk a bit about the contexts that I have seen, because those will be present in the lecture that is to follow. So I have begun my career in psychology, and I have been mainly working in adult psychiatry, doing well, therapy and on the other hand diagnostic work. And on same time I have been working on role-playing games and live-action role-playing games and writing on them. And that has been kind of my two passions, psychology and then game design, which I have studied in Aalto University. And after that, I have been working with Rovio Entertainment and now I'm working in Solita, which is an IT consultancy, as Sarah introduced. And currently I'm working as a PhD candidate. I'm taking a study leave, and I have to say this is quite an exciting project that I'm working on. We are doing a clinical study with a therapeutic game targeting major depressive disorder primarily, and we are assessing its effectiveness. And we are just about to start this clinical study, and I have to say I'm quite excited about that, which also looks precisely into these two topics, game design, and on the other hand, the psychology of mind. So this is kind of like my background. Maybe it helps you understand where I'm coming from. And now to define briefly the key concept that I am using here. And I'm defining this concept partly because this is poorly defined. And I'm talking here about scenarios. So these are, some call it free-form live action role-playing games. Some have called them previously G-form, that has maybe been abandoned, that term. But I call them scenarios in this lecture, that in short are live action role-playing games that you can play anywhere in one evening. So I think that's a neat description, but maybe I'll open that up a bit with a definition I have here, because scenarios could be said that that's my number one interest in this field for several reasons. And scenarios, to define them, first of all, these are pre-written, and often these pre-written scenarios include characters and a plot of some sort, whether it's vague or then it can be more described in detail. And often these scenarios may have both entertainment and artistic ambitions. And one could add, now that we are talking about transformative play, that they may also have transformative ambitions, but I think that is an area that is only rising, and mainly they are played for entertainment and art and artistic frameworks currently. But I think they have a lot of potential in transformative play. These pre-written scenarios then are improvised by the players, and often, unlike some forms of live action role-playing game, these require minimal props, so you don't need to dress up, and they can be, as I said, played anywhere. And often what characterizes these are also the active facilitation by the game master, so that the game master is actively present and guides the game, somewhat like a tabletop role-playing game, or as I like to see it, a leader of a theater play. And I think these scenarios are rather, what they create is a theater play-like experience. There is a narrative arc, but like many other live action role-playing games, they don't have an audience, which is important to bear in mind. And one particular aspect that also characterizes them is that time is compressed and bends like in a movie. This means that often in these scenarios we can use, for instance, cutting to another point in time. There can be predestined endings, and so on. So rather than being an immersive experience where time is one-on-one scale in the game and outside of the game, you can compress the game to have a narrative with focus areas in interesting topics. And to give maybe an example on this, to illustrate this, what a scenario could be for those that are maybe not familiar with it. I could give an example from a game I had the privilege to also play, Love and War by Thea Idegård and Anna Westerling. It is a scenario based on Second World War and about friendships and couples that are formed during this time. It begins briefly before the war actually begins, and it ends briefly after the war ends. So there are some 6 years that are played in roughly 20 short parts that are divided in 5 episodes, as we can see here. For instance, in first episode, Charlie and Jane fall in love, the war starts, and all 4 get involved in war effort. The episode ends with a farewell between Charlie and Jane when he's sent to France and war. This is the context which is played. And then in the next episode, the story continues. I think this is a neat example because this kind of like plays with the scenario format and is a good example of how a plot can be written, but there is some leeway on how it can be improvised by the players, and it creates meaningful play as the story unfolds to the players. And as we can see here, the time is compressed. This game takes maybe 4 to 5 hours to play, but in actual time, it tells a much larger story, something that if it was a Netflix series, it might take a full season or even a longer period of time. So there's a lot of drama, and essentially, if it's not dramatic, it's cut away. So the scenario in a format, it's intense as that there is no essentially slack in the format in regards to drama. And I think an interesting question is, what happens when we intensify the intensity? And I have to say, I have this is also a personal preference that I think the scenarios have a great potential to create really intense experiences. But what if you push this medium, these short scenarios, to the limit? What would happen then? What happens to the group that plays them? What happens to the personal experience of people who play them? What are the limits of these scenarios? Because I think playing this sort of a scenario 4 to 5 hours, I think it's quite a lot already. But what happens if you kind of push it? And that leads to the thought and experiment, if you could say it in this way, that I have had 2 times of organizing 24-hour scenario session. The first one I have organized in maybe 2013 or 14, where the idea is we would have 24 hours of playing scenarios back to back to back to back, so that essentially you always have something new to look forward into. And that has been definitely one of the highlights that I have had the privilege of organizing and running and designing. So I wanted to organize another one. And the second 24 hours scenario session I have run in 2019. And I think I know people do, and I have done LARPs that have lasted 24 hours consecutively or even longer, but there's some kind of downtime. But what happens when you cut all of the downtime, focus on the intensity? What happens then? I think this is the question that to answer, and that is also why we have the mountain picture at the beginning, because I think this is sort of a mountaineering of scenarios. And next, to dive into this topic of a case study. And the reason I wanted to do a case study on this is that I don't think I haven't ever seen this explored as a medium. Scenarios are not very documented, and as Sarah briefly mentioned earlier, that archiving and storing scenarios is very important, but also documenting them is very, very important. And the second reason is that this case study integrates practice with theory. So I hope that we can or I can illuminate both a design mindset, which means understanding how these scenarios can actually be created, and on the other hand, I would show the causes and impact that these scenarios have. So what's ahead is my thoughts on how to design a process for immersion that I'm basing on the concept of variety, and this is done to achieve a state of immersion. And I will conclude this session with a self-reported impact of those who participated in this 24-hour session, so that these are not only my thoughts on how this was designed, but actually from those people who participated in this can share how they actually viewed this. So to open up this case, we will go through this in 4 stages. We will first talk about recruitment, then we will talk about the design principles. We'll talk about the facilitation, what actually happened there during the 24 hours and before and after that. And then we will look at the impact that was evaluated in December last year. That is some time after the 24 hours session was over, which means that I think it's an interesting question of, if you have this sort of intense experience, how do you view it 2.5 years after it has happened? And we will see. Beginning with the recruitment. This is as I said, this is an intense exercise to do. And one of the things I wanted to do is, does anyone else besides me want to do this? And luckily, I did some probing with potential people who might be interested in this, and I got preliminary green light. And I started to move forward with this using an invitation-only policy. This is because this requires substantial amounts of psychological safety that arises from careful selection of people in the group. Partly, that would be the only way to essentially choose the participants, so that I know who they are, how they play, and I essentially have a contact with them, and also that the participants also partly know each other. And we ended up with 6 people plus me, and we also did we were kind of ambitious with the location, and we got very lucky. We got a whole estate for playing these games, which means that we had numerous buildings and a huge location only for this group of people, which was really beneficial for several reasons that I will arrive in just a minute. But this recruitment is a vital part of designing such an experience, but which is why I wanted to highlight this. But maybe we could move forward to how this session was designed. Essentially, one of the thoughts that I wanted to have here is to build a 2-layer dramatic structure to the 24-hour session. Typically, how scenarios are built it is not as linear as in this picture, which describes a dramatic arc where there's sort of an introduction where you typically set the scene of who the characters are, where they are, what are the essential conflicts, what is this scenario about. Then slowly you increase the tension of how the key challenges of the game could be solved, and essentially create an ambiguity of whether they can be solved, and then somehow they are solved through a crisis, and then the intensity kind of declines. This is how typically a scenario has built its arc, and of course you can have numerous peaks, which is even better. That for instance in the game that I mentioned, Love and War, earlier, it had five acts to it, and each act essentially had this sort of a structure to it. So one of the things I wanted to kind of build is to how could we build this dramatic structure through different scenarios so that the dramatic tension would increase throughout the session, that we would start slow and then we would kind of gradually work up the intensity throughout as the hours passed until it would climax around the 22-hour times. So maybe 1-2 hours before the session would end, and that it would have this sort of small peaks, but gradually you would essentially turn up the volume, and I think this was kind of the key principle for building this exercise. So to achieve this, we need to introduce a design principle for variety. One of the things that we humans are really good at is learning. That we learn certain patterns, and when we learn certain patterns, we kind of acclimatize to it. So we kind of like understand that this is no longer news, but rather it's these are how things are. And this acclimatization is a pathway to boredom and a loss of interest. So essentially, this is also what, if we think of use this flow channel, which is an often used framework for in-game design, where you have to kind of balance between introducing high challenge, which leads, if it's excessive challenge, it leads to anxiety, feeling with the players that I can't do this. And if you don't have enough challenge, it leads to boredom. So essentially you have to introduce sufficient challenge that is in regards to the group's not only their skill, but also where the group is emotionally at. This means that you can guide the group towards growing intensity by introducing new stimuli. But you have to introduce new stimuli, meaning you have to have variety, because otherwise people will fall into boredom. And to achieve this, then the variety is created by introducing different mediums. This means that we had the scenarios as the backbone of the 24 hours, but in addition, there were kind of shaking things up was contact improvisation, also traditional theater improvisation, singing, and traditional tabletop role-playing games, or one instance of it. This means that there is always something to look forward to, which means that we can keep the dramatic tension increasing. But in addition to different mediums, there's also variety that is pursued through variance in emotional intensity, which means that the session includes both comedy, that is more lighthearted, scenarios where the focus is more on entertainment, having fun, and then there's serious drama that deals with more grave topics. And on the other hand, there's also demands to physicality that you can increase, for instance, people to move, for instance, using contact improvisation and scenarios that require that have high physical demands, and then toning it down with for instance, a tabletop game. And I think this variety is a key concept that is, I think, under-researched also in many ways in game design, because this is also a very crucial concept, because many games are built around variety. That you have, for instance, if you think about many digital games, they are built around core loop, where you have a certain game round, for instance, that is repeated, but then you build a sort of a meta game around that core loop, where it's the core loop that is enjoyed by the players is enjoyed, but you as the game, which means that it grows, for instance, more complex, which allows the player to stay in the flow channel, which is then perceived by the players as pleasurable and entertaining and challenging. All right, let's move to the third part, which is facilitating this 24-hour session. So we started on Friday, and I think one of the things that we notice here, that we have the 24-hour session is at the core, but it takes quite a lot of time for us to arrive there. And this is one of the things that we have to appreciate from the design mindset, that there's a lot of work that has to be done in order to achieve a certain state or a certain outcome that we want. A lot of preparation. So there have been already a lot of work done before this, but now we are on Friday. We drove to the location, we got to know it, we kind of explored it. It was a rather big estate that we had there. We also did an orientation of a couple of hours. We talked especially about the principles for the session. I find that these are really important, that we talk about what's the mindset that we have here and what's the reason for us to engage in such an activity. We talked about the importance of exploration, which means that I think in improvisation and scenarios, it's really important for people to know that there's no right and wrong answers, but there can be various answers that we can explore, and we can do, for instance, we can fail, and there is no such thing as failing. We can just explore and try things out, and what works, and some things don't work, and it's all right. And that's the acceptance part. Boundaries are also important. We talked about this, and we introduced safety mechanics of red, which means let's end this, and yellow, which is let's tone certain interaction down. We also discussed the expectations that people have, and at this point, I think it was interesting and also reflects one person's awareness of their boundaries, that one player opts out of the last exercise because they felt that they don't have the energy to go full 24 hours, but rather they want to opt out of the last one so that they can get enough sleep, which was completely fine, of course. And I think it was also a great example of a person saying that what they need, and then that the group is, oh, we are fine with that, of course. Then the 24 session actually started, and this is actual photograph of the location. It's lush green environment of beautiful early summer in Finland. Absolutely gorgeous. And the first thing where we started at 6 a.m. The first thing we did was conduct improvisation in silence. Then one of my favorites, Stoke Birmingham 00, while we had breakfast, more improvisation theater and a technique I had learned previously, Midsummer technique that explores feeling of emotions. But I think instead of going to very precise details, I think one of the key things here is to note that we had 3.5 hours of warm-up. And I think this is a luxury. If you have a scenario you play maybe over a weekend, you may have 1 hour, 2 hours of warm-up at best, if you have that time. But I want to put a considerable amount of time into this, and we had 3.5 hours, which was really good for the team. We woke up slowly. We kind of like got into a mood where we are, got to know people. We didn't rush it at all. And then when after eating some breakfast and having some warm up, we went on with the first scenario written by Christopher Rutcher and Mads Brunum, Joan the Vampire Slayer. I wanted to start with really light-hearted, really easy scenario that is kind of fun and gets everyone in the good mood, and I think this was quite a success. It's a physical, or we made it physical. We went around the estate, and we also had some music playing. It was quite a good start. So we essentially the first 6 hours is kind of waking up the group and getting people to interact, having some fun. And then kind of after this first 6 hours, I wanted to introduce the first game that had synergy with the location that we had, called The Naked Truth, that takes place actually in a sauna. And as I said, scenarios you can play scenarios anywhere, but we just happened to be in a place that had an actual wood burning sauna. And the scenario took place in a wood burning sauna where Finnish men are talking about real emotions. So there was a good synergy with the game. The Naked Truth, written by Arttu Hanska and Joonas Katko, is a really wonderful game. It has a theme of friendship, also synergistic with the pace that we had here. We had like warmed up people. Now it was trying to get introduce suddenly more serious themes and kind of talk about more honest feelings. I would love to tell you more about this, but the players played in the sauna and I sat outside watching the beautiful scenery that we had there. But players did enjoy this, but it's a strange feeling for a game master when you are outside of the game's immersion, and you can only say that. Glad you enjoyed it. All right, this is what it looks like actually in the morning. It's beautiful place. Old trees and the sun was shining. We got really lucky with the weather also. And then another game that was synergistic with the location was by Mikkel Bjerkgaard, called Midsummer. That is a scenario that takes things even more serious. There's a mother and daughter who are grieving the loss of a father who magically reappears and shakes things up. from behind the grave. This was also taking place in a countryside, I think in Sweden, but I think the location also fit there as well. So I think this worked out quite nicely. We also had a place indoors because we kind of alternated, as I said, between being outdoors, then kind of eating a bit, being indoors, then going outdoors, and constantly introducing this variety, as I said. Then we had some warm-up with singing, with Les Miserables, and then we introduced Opera Buffo by Taylor Stokes, which is essentially a improvised opera, as it says here, where one of the recurring characters is a playful goat, as in the picture. It's a hilarious scenario, so back to lighter tones, and I think this, while it is light toned, this is a really difficult game in some ways, in that it requires the players to recitate while they act, and it which is quite challenging. In addition that you are acting, you are also essentially singing. But at this point, so we had been playing some 18 hours at this point. This was the fourth large scenario, and this was, at this point, there was something magical that happened. And I think this was I could say that this was a breakthrough for the whole group, that the self-awareness was gone. And what happened was a group level flow, that previously there had been flow, but this was among the deepest flows I've experienced in role-playing games, which was shared by the players, as well as we discussed about this, that even though this was a really demanding game, everyone was there in a deep state of presence. And I will return to this experience to open this up in just a minute. But let's see how the whole 24 hours unfolded first. Then we continued after this was high energy, this Opera Buffo. We continued with a tabletop role-playing game, 10 Candles by Stephen Dewey, to kind of pace down the intensity and kind of wipe up the sweat and cool down a bit, which was actually played in the relative darkness. There was with 10 candles that were slowly lit and then smothered throughout the game. It's a horror game. And finally, the 10 Candles was the fifth large, you could say, scenario, and sixth scenario was called Down the Memory Lane, which I had particularly designed to be the kind of highlight of the session, and or at least the pushing the intensity in the when you have played for 21 hours, you're really exhausted. What happens then? And here I wanted to do, I have written one game where the players sleep, or part of the players sleep while they play, and then they woke up to play. And this was another game that explores this mechanic, where essentially the players who are now exhausted, majority of them sleep, but 2 of the players are awake. And the idea is that you wake from your slumber, and then you come to explore the game, which occurs now in the early morning hours. There was actually mist floating in the early morning amongst the trees, which was really beautiful. And what the characters were trying to do was they were trying to make sense of a person's life, and to add what the players had done, they had brought pictures, as you can see in this small picture above. They had brought pictures from their own life, and the characters were trying to puzzle together who were the people in the picture that were actually related to the players, but in the game they weren't. And in the game, the protagonist is looking through these old photographs to make sense of who they were. And they were combined in this sort of a wall, as you can see in the picture, chronologically, to make a life's narrative of the protagonist, which was the end state of the game. That it began with a clear board, and then the players slowly added pictures there of the protagonist's memories, because all of the players were the essentially thoughts in this one protagonist's mind. As you notice, this is a complex game, and the complexity is really high. I think if you are awake and you play this, I think it's still challenging, but doable. If you have been playing 18 hours, it's challenging, and I think a dreamlike state was found by the players. However, no one understood the game, which was interesting. The exhaustion was too much. The game did flow, but it was beyond the players what it meant, which is, I think, quite interesting. That the players didn't report that they hated the game. They just said, I didn't know what to make out of this. And then the session ended. On Sunday, we had a debriefing experience with the group where we talked about how the game went. Now to talk a bit about the immersion that I mentioned about the magical breakthrough. Immersion is really interesting phenomena, and often immersion is approached as a state. And this is, I think, often due to the methodologies used. So that immersion is often measured in questionnaires, although there are some studies that have sought to find relationship between eye movement and immersion, for instance, but there I haven't seen many of those lately. There are three key questionnaires that are used in digital games to explore immersion, and they, what we can see here is that they also break the concept of immersion down in different ways. For instance, immersive experience questionnaire breaks it down to cognitive and emotional involvement, real-world dissociation, challenge and control, whereas player experience of need satisfaction model uses this competence autonomy relatedness framework by Desi and Ryan to focus on motivation, and adds that controls and presence / immersion. These all questionnaires rather highly correlate with each other, so we could say that at least they are tapping into the same sphere, but there isn't a particular, you could say, shared complete agreement on what immersion is. But we can say that immersion is at least related to many things and many phenomena that are more well described, such as, for instance, flow, cognitive absorption, presence, and also immersive could be described as alternative state of consciousness. So often we could say that immersion is approached as a state where a person is no little more or extremely immersed, and how to understand this relay is conveyed by the player through self-reporting, so that we can from the outside generally know whether someone is immersed or not. Here are some of the thoughts I think that I would like to talk about regarding immersion. We can see that there are more some things and less other things when immersion occurs. There's more presence in the moment, kind of mindful presence, which means that on the other hand, there's less neurotic self-awareness of oneself. And one focuses on the activity itself, losing track and time sometimes, and even outside of the external context, going into this magical sphere, which means that on the other hand, one is not aware of distractions. One thing that I haven't seen actually discussed is self-acceptance. And I think this is an interesting concept to kind of think about. Can immersion lead to more self-acceptance because you are focused on the moment? Perhaps you're in a playful state of mind if the game is such that where you are encouraged to play, and scenarios that I like to focus on often have a playful quality to them, which means that the group accepts such behaviors that are not maybe typically accepted, or if it would happen outside the playful sphere, would be maybe frowned upon. So immersion in such a social game as I'm referring to could also be related to self-acceptance and feeling of emotions. That many of these scenario games are such that they actually encourage feeling even negative emotions or exploring them: anxiety, fear, sadness, forming relationships, breaking them. Many things that are not things, if they would happen outside, wouldn't be as easy to accept. So I think this is something that would merit more discussion and exploration, is the relationship of immersion and self-acceptance and feeling of emotions. One example on this is from the opera buffo that I mentioned. This is a quote from one of the participants. In one improvisation, I sang and it was fun. Typically, I avoid singing as much as I can. I think this is quite a remarkable thing, to do something you don't typically do in a social setting where shame and other negative feelings may keep you back from doing the things that you might want to do, but you are disencouraged for some internal reason to do. Right. So, on the other hand, if we can think about immersion as a state, there are also models which describe that immersion occurs in interaction with a game artifact. And this is often, this is from Ermi and Maura, a classical, beautiful paper that describes sensory, challenge-based and imaginative immersion that occurs between the player and the game. And this focuses on a digital game that is an artifact. However, and I think here we can also bear in mind about the medium that we are focusing on now, that we are now, when we talk about scenarios, the game artifact isn't a digital artifact, nor is it a board game, but the game in this setting is a social instance. So the game is social in nature, which means that immersion is something that occurs socially between the players and in a shared imagination, which means that immersion could be viewed also as a process that occurs within the group. And this brings to an alternative perspective to immersion, that immersion as a process. And again, we can see things that add towards or contribute towards this process, and some things that we can, through a process, remove forces that hinder from person going into a state of immersion. And these are some of the things that are drawn from the 24-hour session. First of all, things that add towards the immersion is the contact that participants had between each other. We had agreed upon rules that were stated and discussed beforehand. We had participant autonomy to not participate in it, so no one was forced to do anything, and this was explicitly stated and also presented as one person did, that they opted out. We had a location which was secluded. We had social validation of the self, which is people can explore new roles. We can also express feelings. We have variance in stimuli. We had these things lead to a trust within group, which is also called psychological safety, which is something that also I think is meaningful to understand as a process. And then finally, we have sleep deprivation that acts hinders inhibition as well. So now, on the other hand, we have removing forces that hinder immersion, that are, for instance, social expectations that may be also contextually bound, which means that when we are, for instance, in a work setting, we are expected to behave in a certain way. But now when we change the location, we change the group, there are new rules, and we are conscious of this fact and also trying to be more free of those said rules, which means that these are things that are contributing to an immersion as a social process, which then leads to an immersion as a state. And I think this far we have been both discussing theory and practice, but I think one really intriguing aspect is evaluating impact. So going back to the question, what happens when we intensify the intensity? We have to not only look at how things are viewed from the game master or organizer side, but also about how participants felt. So I conducted a questionnaire to the players 2.5 years later, and to know how they felt about this experience 2.5 years later. And of course, we have to bear in mind that first of all, the sample size is small. We have 5 people. However, on the other hand, we have 5 people, which is more than 0 people, for instance, which is also important to bear in mind. The first question that we have, what was most impactful and important for you in the 24-hour game session? These are shortened versions of the 5 people who answered to the question out of 6 participants. And I would perhaps read these because I think these have interesting perspectives. When we were playing in the early morning hours, I was impressed by the fact that I let go in a new way. I no longer thought of what my actions look like. Too often, one thinks whether one's behavior is skillful enough. The long sauna improvisation felt strangely real. Being together intensively and sharing experiences with others was most impactful to me. You can't achieve this in a shorter session. The erosion of self-censorship due to tiredness and sufficient 18-hour warm-up is a rare treat. Impro gets to a new path in a tight-knit group, yet forming new relationships was probably most important. Getting in touch with immersive, present, playful, curious state of mind that is in touch with one's feelings and sharing it with other participants. I consider this state very important to me, but it is rare to spend extensive amounts of time in this state. How we went deeper and deeper. There was always new things in store. It was interesting and fun. It is also worth noting that we got closer to other people, other improv people. We experienced and did something extraordinary together. There are some things that repeat in these stories or answers that people gave. And I think there are two things. First, there's a sense of immersion. And secondly, there's social connection. And I think what is interesting is that these were the only two things that was so broadly shared. And these were present in almost every answer. And of course, I think this goes back to the medium. Immersion was what this whole experience was built to create. And secondly, social connection or social interaction was at the essence of the medium. We were there together with other people, and not only they created the process, which led to the state of immersion. Now, a second question was if that answer to what was most impactful. Now the question is how meaningful the session was. And now an example of how not to do questionnaires. On a scale from 1 to 7, the answer is the meaningfulness is between 5 to 7. Because I knew this wouldn't mean anything, I asked the same question in this way. Which other event has had a roughly as big of an impact on you as did this 24-hour session? An intense weekend at the cabin with the other friends, intense tabletop role-playing game campaign over 2 weekends, graduation party, intense theater production, traveling abroad, and psychedelics, trip abroad with one-way ticket and picking up someone at the street in the middle of the day. I think it kind of puts this session kind of on a broader context. That of course I did spend quite a lot of time designing and thinking about this, but from the participant point of view, this was only one experience of many impactful things in their lives. And I think this is also an important thing to bear in mind. I also explicitly asked, how did the 24-hour game session change you as a person? And there were interesting answers. There were many short-term effects. More relaxed presence, for instance. Some people felt that they were more curious, more imaginative. Majority also found that they built new social relations or strengthened the existing ones. And also a third factor is kind of understanding oneself or understanding the importance of spontaneity that was at the core of what we did together and trusting oneself. But then these are kind of some things that people felt immediately after. But when it comes to long-term effects, 4 of the 5 reflect that either there weren't particular long-term effects, or on the other hand, they may be difficult to identify. And I think understanding what sort of impact this would have, I think the measurement would have to be different than this sort of a questionnaire. So this questionnaire isn't perhaps the best way to measure such a thing. But I did present 10 different things of what might happen or what the people might feel after such a event, and these are the responses. People found that the session offered a connection with others and offered a chance to relax. And on the other hand, they didn't feel that it was primarily entertainment. And I think this also reflects the social nature of the event. And when asked, would you participate again? Everyone answered that they would participate again. Although some said that their family life does put some challenges and time would have to be adjusted because this is rather demanding. So to conclude, two things. First of all, I think I would go back to the thought that it's important to understand immersion as a process, as well as understanding the psychological state, and how such a state is produced is maybe more important to understand from a design point of view and also from a psychological point of view than the state itself. And there are numerous things that you can do to contribute towards the state. However, the nature of the game, whether we are talking about digital scenarios, live action role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, they have distinct features that contribute towards the achieving such a state. Also, and I think this is now also commenting on Sarah's earlier lecture on transformative game, is that strong experience alone doesn't lead to growth. And this is kind of me looking at the results from the questionnaire from this side, that what didn't happen is that no one particularly said that after 2 years I still go back to the one thing and I now find that changed. Maybe something did, but they can't elaborate on it, or maybe growth didn't happen. We don't know. But what we could say is that strong experience alone doesn't necessarily lead to growth. And here I'm thinking about Kolb's experiential learning cycle that has essentially 4 stages. First, you have some sort of active experimentation. You do something that leads to a concrete experience of feeling it, and then you reflect upon what just happened. Then you form an abstract conceptualization, essentially reflect on it, and then the will goes back, which here we can see system 1, that is experiencing something firsthand, and then system 2, which is the reflective side, using Kahneman's terms here. We can see how these two essentially interact, that we need to have both experiences and reflection. So in the 24-hour session, we had included active experimentation and doing, but there was less reflective observation. And if we would want to talk about transformative games, we would have to take a bit of a different approach. And I think, first of all, we would have to design games for certain outcomes. Then we would have to invite people with a certain intention for change, then have the game experience, and then conduct meaning making and reflection afterwards. And now, of course, in this, we had, like in many entertainment and artistic games, you have the game experience, but what happens before and after those are paid less attention to. And I think this is vital to bear in mind. So if we want to make transformative games, this means that we have to make a change from entertainment to a serious game with a certain intention of change, which actually is reflected to all of these factors. That if you design a game for certain outcomes, the game becomes not an artistic or entertainment game, but a serious game that is qualitatively different from the other groups, and it's also evaluated in different ways, and it's also perceived in different ways by the players. And we know that the expectation and intention that players have when they begin a certain experience will affect how the game is experienced and what impact it actually has. And also it influences the game experience. So how can you now achieve a state of flow if you play to achieve a certain outcome, but you don't want to play to achieve a certain outcome? And finally, the reflection requires time, space, and competence, which needs kind of different set of skills that are maybe typically associated in these sort of games. However, I would like to close off with this thought that immersion has been at the core of this lecture that I've had, and I think immersion has, in these sort of social games, it has a lot of power. And it does offer new experience and connection with others. And that is very, very, very meaningful. How that can be used in transformation, that is a vital and very interesting question. And I think we still need to understand quite a bit about how to create processes for immersion to achieve the state and how it relates to social processes in the group. With this thought, I would like to conclude and thank everyone for listening. Do not hesitate to contact me if you wish to discuss this sort of things, or if you want to ask questions about my designs of games. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to stop the screen share, we can do a little bit of Q&A. All right. That was a wonderful deep dive into lots of immersion theories. And I really appreciated your insights around psychological safety. That's going to be a main feature of this particular season of the Transformative Play Initiative event series. So I'm really happy that we touched on that in this talk. Okay, there's a lot of different questions here. I'm going to sort of cherry pick one. I think this one particularly is really interesting because you asked a question that I never really thought to ask, which now I'm going to ask people, which is what does this experience remind you of in terms of other experiences that you have had? And someone would like to know what would be the difference between this to another kind of intense workshop weekend without LARPs. So for example, New Age, Tantra, self-development, ritualistic, etc.
All right. Two really good questions. So first of all, what does this remind me of, and how does this compare to other sort of experiences in the same field? Perhaps if I would start, what does this remind me of? I have to say it reminds me of the other 24-hour session. It reminds me of the environment, but as a feeling, I think it was rather unique. It maybe reminds me of the improvisation theater that I also run, other scenarios, but I think there was something very unique in what was achieved in this. So I have to say that for me, it reminds me of many of the experience I've had in the similar fields, which maybe bridges to the question that how does this compare to for instance, Tantra or self-development workshops. And I think it relates to the concept of immersion, where there is a fiction in which the players go in, which means that there is an alternative world, also an alternative identity that the players can explore. And this, while this can be done in sort of a self-development seminar, sometimes Tantra may involve role work, but the framework is, I think, of how I have experienced them is different. That the fiction, there isn't as prevalent fiction added to these experiences, which I think differentiates them.
I would also offer that if we look at the intentionality component that you mentioned, I think if people are explicitly going to a self-development workshop, then they already have at least some anticipation that there might be some self-development that's going on, even if they're maybe there to meet friends or have other kinds of experiences. That intentionality and that goal is very is there from the outset. So that could be another avenue to explore this question.
Yes, precisely. Glad that you said that, because there's many motivations or many mindsets or aspects of how you can look at these games, and the games that were included in this had more of an entertainment or artistic framework to them, whereas if you go to a self-development seminar, it's already stated in the title that this is what is going to happen, and you kind of know to expect this, which is a different invites different expectations, invites a different intention, and also interactions.
Alibi, in a way.
Yes.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it gives us permission, social permission, to behave in certain ways within the space. Someone is asking, I'm thinking of the research I recently read about performance in interactive theater, that the immersion into the character in fictions intensify from 30 hours onward. And I wonder if you know about or have played long form LARPs that use exactly the tools you were talking about, such as jumping in time, act breaks, black box, and other meta techniques. In my mind, to have downtime, such as act breaks, actually intensifies your understandings, emotions, and eventual transformation. Incubation time, quote unquote, I will call it.
Right. Yes, I think this goes back to the question of a medium that personally, and I think also personal preference partly, that I like personally my live action role playing games kind of condensed and short and sweet, and that's how I like it. I have also played longer games for over a weekend, where it has taken maybe 48 hours or longer. Personally, as I said, I have a preference towards the shorter form, but I think those are different mediums, and people may find them in different way, because there are things that kind of take time, and there's kind of leisure, downtime, and as said, incubation, where you can kind of enjoy the atmosphere, kind of like have a mindful presence there, kind of have some personal time. But this is in contrast to the scenarios that I'm describing here, where they eliminate all of that. There is little to know of that, and I like it that way, and that's the medium that I'm exploring. So for that reason, unfortunately, I couldn't answer that question, because that is outside the field explored.
So interested about this reflection time, and if it's necessary to be built in, particularly if we want to have transformative experiences during the game or not. Like, this incubation time is very, very interesting. But I also know for some people, they can't get into that state of lack of self-consciousness without being pushed to the extreme. And so along those lines, there's another question here. It's sort of more of a statement, but I think it's something to think about. There was a Swedish LARP, Azelen, which was also 24 hours with 30 to 40 players, extremely intense. It was a torture / asylum, according to the designer, and nearly no meta techniques other than stop words. It was what you see is what you get, meaning that there was sexuality and pain too, if players consented to that. So when we're thinking about intensity, what would you say maybe phenomenologically are the differences between what you were creating, which has all of these different kinds of experiences, this variety of experiences, versus something like what's being described here, where it sounds like people are being pushed to their limits with similar kinds of activities?
Right. I'll maybe go back to the definition that I had. Sometimes the bending of time is a differentiating feature, where I think the scenarios compress time, and I think this is a technique that every time you watch a movie, you see this in action. In a movie, it only takes the interesting parts. Everything that is mundane, that is boring, everything that kind of where the characters are kind of zoning out, and everything is cut away. And that is something that this sort of other types of LARPs kind of keep in, that there is time for creating something that occurs from the person outward, so that the person is free to more freer to maybe be in a certain state, kind of explore that state that occurs in themselves, have that maybe personal reflection time, because there is downtime in the play where nothing is happening, but there is, that something is happening in 1 hour, so you can maybe think about what happens, or then something happens and then there's 2 hours of not much happening, and then you kind of can reflect upon that. Whereas here in these scenarios, there's a lot of more emphasis on narration, that it is a story that is being told, that is shared within the group, and this is now making a difference between a personal story and a story that is shared within the group, meaning that in a scenario, everyone can tell what happened roughly. They have their own viewpoint, but everyone played the same story, more or less. When you have a LARP, maybe you have even more people, also maybe 20 people, which also changes the group dynamics, which means that people have more divergent experiences because there's less control over the narrative that occurs during this play, and therefore you may have more diversity. If you would ask people what was this game about, what would you ask, you would have maybe more different stories that people would tell. Would that make sense?
What you're talking about reminds me of narrative immersion, which we didn't really talk about in the list because a lot of it's just because. And another person asked, how would you define intensity? What does it mean to be more intense? And from what I got from your talk was that intensity is correlated with these deep immersive states. Like, how can we go deeper and deeper into immersion? But narrative immersion requires us to hold a framework in our head, and when people got to the last experience where they were half asleep and tired, and it sounds like it was difficult to hold that narrative framework in their head. And I also wonder, when we're talking about these like very intense BDSM-esque type LARPs, if narrative is as strong of a feature, or if it's more about the physical intensity or emotional intensity of those moments. How do we link back into narrative in between those spikes of intensity? So in my research, I find that people are differently wired, I think. They have different preferences in terms of what immerses them. And a lot of people need story, other people don't. But I think this is a really interesting area for us to explore in terms of immersion is when does narrative help and when does it get in the way a little bit?
And I think this is, you touch upon a really important point about the variance between people, that I think there are some people who are particularly drawn towards this medium. Some are drawn towards Tantra, some like longer form live action role-playing games, some like tabletop role-playing games, then some like in the tabletop role-playing games, you have differences, whether they have kind of mechanistic focus, narrative focus. And what we, I think, struggle with, there are some tools to kind of tap into this difference that I think people have hard time knowing and putting words to what their preference in this field is. And that is partly related to the tools that we have and the frameworks that we have. For instance, if you want to start something with a new group, you can have, for instance, a certain framework of concepts of how you would like to play, and essentially have some sort of like sliders of where would you like to be in sort of between narration and a personal focus, or pacing. Do you want it fast paced and no downtime at all, versus you want a lot of downtime, a lot of like feeling the environment. And I think this is something that would be really, really interesting to explore more. There are, of course, the motivation models that are existing that differentiate between players, but it's still always relevant question to ask who are present in a certain game, because choosing the players affects, of course, how it is felt, and this also relates to informed consent, that that those who organize anything have to be able to elaborate what's the experience about and what the player should know beforehand, so that they can make the informed consent about, and also maybe target towards certain people.
I want to ask you 12 more questions, but let's go to the Q&A. Recently, there's a new trend in international LARPs in Europe to design for enough sleep, because it is believed to give stronger character immersion when you are well rested. What do you think about that? And again, character immersion here, I think, is referring to the ability to stay in character and be with the feelings and the thoughts of your character.
Right. I think we have to look at this from put this into a context. If typically when you have a longer live action role-playing game, let's say take several days, there I think it's more likely that people don't get enough sleep. Then people get cranky when you don't have enough nutrition towards that. Then you have some friction with people. Then it's not the best experience. So it makes sense to focus on people's well-being, especially during such a long exposure live action role-playing game. However, when we look at scenarios that are typically, let's say, 4 hours long, the issue of sleep is never an issue typically. That so for this reason, the question here is what happens when because typically people come to play scenarios, they are well rested. So what happens when we do the opposite? We push them, and I think this goes back to what happens when we are tired. And I think one thing that may happen is our inhibitions may lower just a tiny bit, or depending on a person, and it may cause the sleep deprivation, maybe also contribute to an altered state of consciousness that may also at some point feel like intoxication if it continues. And so that this was, in this case, this was consciously intended to contribute towards deepening immersion, and I think it did achieve that goal, which I haven't seen in this format before.
Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about immersion here, are we still talking about holding the character?
That's a really good question. I think this relates to the group dynamics, that when we have a sort of for instance, the opera buffo, that is such a silly game and intended to be that way. So essentially, the more outrageous and stupid you can play and kind of like be out there on the edge and do things you wouldn't normally do, the better it becomes. So there, the lowering of inhibitions works very well towards the whole narrative and towards that game particularly. But that is what you, Sara, said as narrative immersion, where it's creates a certain narrative and not necessarily makes it easy to hold a certain character in one's head.
It is very interesting what you said, what you and your participants said about the long-term effect. Do you think that such events could create long-term effects if they are not one-off, but rather recurring time to time, given it is the same group of people and you hold space for them for reflection in between the sessions? Excellent question.
Yes. I think when you have an intense experience with some people that is shared and unique, that creates a bond between people. And this narrative immersion, considered as something that occurs on the group level, it is something that people who haven't been there, it's really hard to understand what is it like. And this means that the experience is unique. Of course, all experience, if you go to a foreign town with your friend, it's a unique experience, it's difficult to convey. But when it goes to this sort of narrative immersion, the immersion into a fictional state, and role-playing within a role-playing medium that is difficult to understand from the outside, it makes a certain feeling that we know this together, which is also something that can be positive or negative. If one would have this sort of intense weekends, and what would happen if this would recur every month? I think that would be something that would be, especially if you would have sort of talk more about the intention and kind of build a lot of trust between people, because these are intense games that deal with emotional subjects that address often rather hard aspects or harder aspects in life. For instance, separation, death, anxiety, as I mentioned. I think there is meaning in that, to create space to process such things that are to which there is less space to. And I think there lies the therapeutic potential partly also.
I have many things to say about that as well. We have 2 more minutes, and I'm wondering if we can address this in the lightning round. Somebody is wondering if the lowering of intensity after the experience, when we looked at the rising climax and the Aristotelian model of drama, if the lowering of the intensity of after the climax would be the debrief in your experience.
I think I would separate it as something that occurs outside the drama, meaning that that describes the fiction that is the magical sphere that occurs, and the debrief occurs afterwards outside the drama. So I would say it that way.
And there's also bleed to consider. So, things get much more complicated when we think about that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I'm so happy that you joined us today. And our next talk, as I mentioned, is going to be about psychological safety, and it's going to be by John Stavropoulos. I believe the date is February 7th, but I will be doing an announcement tomorrow. But for now, let's all give a big round of applause and thank Lauri for being here today.
Thank you.